G'day, g'day. It's Nick here and welcome to another episode of Wicked Wildlife. And today I wanted to talk a bit about native wildlife as pets. It gets around social media from time to time and it's a pretty controversial issue with plenty of fors and againsts. So stick around, we'll have a bit of a look at it and weigh up just should we be keeping wildlife as pets at home. This is totally no residence. Hello. It is listed as a G'day guys. So when people start talking about wildlife as pets and should we keep them or shouldn't we keep them and why not, they generally jump to examples like quolls and wombats and kangaroos, but a lot of people forget that there's a lot of native Australian animals that have been kept as pets by people for an awful long time. Things like turtles and blue-tongued lizards are pretty common pets for kids and adults alike. Budgerigars, cockatiels, cockatoos, these are all native Australian animals that we don't really consider exotic animals. In the last 10 years especially, reptile keeping has become a huge hobby. A lot of our pythons make brilliant pets, and most states do allow people to keep native reptiles with licenses and records to be kept. On top of that, there's a couple of states that do already allow people to keep things like sugar gliders and possums. So whether or not we believe people should be keeping our native animals, currently there is lots of people out there already doing it. Some look after them better than others, just like cats and dogs, but it's not a new concept. It's already happening, guys. So a part of the discussion is, do native animals even make good pets? Well, it's yes and no. You see, there's a big difference with keeping something like a 16-foot saltwater crocodile or an adult red kangaroo versus something like a native mouse or parrot or geckos, for instance. So we can't say that native animals don't make good pets. Some of them make brilliant pets. Others are only suitable for people particularly interested. A lot of them can become aggressive as they're older. Things like wombats, once they reach maturity, aren't an animal that the average person can handle. Hand-raised kangaroos are often the same. Venomous snakes and crocodiles, they require some specialist experience. However, things like parrots and reptiles and sugar gliders and possums and the like, they do have some specialist requirements. We can't go to the supermarket and just buy stuff off a shelf and have them live off that. However, there's a lot of animals we already keep. People keep ferrets and other exotic birds and tropical fish, and all these animals require some specialist skills to look after. And people have the right to go out there and learn these skills and then look after the animals. And for the vast majority of cases, it works out fine. So, arguably, keeping native animals should be along much the same lines. So they're not going to replace cats and dogs. They're a different type of pet in their own right. So it's not like we're going to get rid of cats and dogs and everybody's going to keep wildlife. However, there is a lot of people out there who have a genuine passion for wildlife and have the ability and the interest to look after them and care for them properly. So one of the reasons that some people are saying that we should be keeping wildlife as pets is because it's good for conservation. And one of these reasons being is they say that if animals disappear in the wild, we're going to have captive populations that we can release from. Now, in reality, this isn't going to happen. If you go to any pet store today or a reptile show or the similar, and you have a look at bearded dragons like these guys, you'll find bearded dragons that are reds and yellows and all sorts of colours and patterns that don't exist in the wild. It's the same with things like cockatiels or budgerigars. How many blue budgerigars are there? So over time we've bred animals to look the way we want and not really represent how they are in the wild. So these animals aren't obviously candidates to be released into the wild if their endangered cousins start to disappear. And their progeny also aren't, because a bearded dragon like this, for instance, could have a yellow parent and throw babies that aren't their natural colour. So if we ran out of zebras in the wild, we wouldn't want to release donkeys, and it's much the same with some of our native animals. The colour morphs and mutations might be interesting, but they're not going to be released into the wild. However, there is another benefit as far as conservation and caring for wildlife goes. And that one is, I think, that keeping native animals as pets builds an empathy for wildlife. You see, you might never own a dog in your life, but if you see somebody mistreating a dog, or you see a puppy on Facebook that needs a home, it pulls at your heartstrings. And the reason being is our culture is brought up to like dogs. Everybody likes dogs. So if we start keeping things like possums, for instance, perhaps when you see a possum on the side of the road, you might have that tug at your heart to go and check the pouch to see if there's a baby that might need to go to a wildlife carer. Also, as we start to include native animals in our lives, perhaps wildlife carers will start to receive the same sort of donations from the public as lost dogs homes, for instance, because we care about it. We can relate to these animals. So I think building a natural empathy for wild animals is a far bigger advantage of keeping native animals as pets than being able to release them back into the wild again. The other thing is, it sparks an interest. If kids keep something like a possum at home, or their friends have a possum or a sugar glider or parrots at home, and they go home and they can't keep them themselves, but it spurs them to put up some nest boxes or plant some trees, this is a good thing. So there's plenty of other benefits. The other big one is you never know where it's going to lead. My favourite example is Australia Zoo. Australia Zoo, Steve Irwin wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for Bob Irwin starting off with a private collection of animals. He collected reptiles as a hobby, as a personal interest. He moved to Queensland, started a zoo, and had a son who changed the lives of millions and sparked a huge interest in conservation. This wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for people being allowed to keep certain native animals as pets. The last big thing is as far as veterinary knowledge goes with wildlife. If you speak to any wildlife carer, one of their biggest issues is the vast majority of vets have very little understanding or training looking after and caring and treating native animals. Now, in the last few decades, reptiles and birds have sort of come ahead. As more people have started keeping these animals, there's been vets go out and spend the effort to learn to look after them. Because currently, it's not financially viable for a vet to spend a great deal of time and money learning how to keep possums and sugar gliders and how to treat their illnesses if there's not people paying money to have those animals looked after. So if we start keeping them as pets, wildlife carers are going to see an increase in the amount of vets that actually invest time and effort into learning how to treat these species. So while we might be bringing in a bearded dragon, somebody else might use those same skills that they've learnt to treat something like an endangered earless dragon. So while the animals aren't going to be released into the wild again, there is a whole heap of other benefits that people don't generally think about to keeping native animals. So with all this in mind, do I think that people should be getting rid of their cats and dogs and keeping dingoes and wombats and koalas? And no, they shouldn't. You see, not everybody's cut out to keep native animals. In the same respect that not everybody is cut out to keep cats or dogs or ferrets. However, there is a lot of people out there who already do keep these animals legally and very successfully. And I don't see any reason that should change. Now, I certainly hope we don't see the day where you can go into a pet shop and no questions asked buy something like a feather-tail glider or some of our orange-bellied parrots or something. However, if people do want to keep these animals, there is lots of ways they can go about it. Now, good places to start would be something like your local herpetological society if you're interested in reptiles, avicultural clubs for the bird keepers, and there's a Marsupial Society of Victoria and of Australia. So there's plenty of places to get started if you do want to keep native animals and do it the right way. If you can't find any of these places, feel free to get in touch with us. We're always happy to help people start off on the right foot. We're contactable on Facebook or at www.wickedwildlife.com. In the meantime, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's always plenty more videos coming. And other than that, guys, I hope you have a great one and take care.